All right, so good morning, everyone. We've had a couple of weeks off from this community sync, so we are back and in full power. Full power? I don't know. But we have a few updates today to go through. Some pretty exciting stuff from the team. I think up first we'll have some updates from Jimothy on some docs updates. We have an update from Andy on authenticated user workflow for checkout. We have an update from Jimmy today for the Peregrine search component, the progress that we've been making there. And then I think finally we'll have James talk about anything that he's been working on for the last couple of weeks.
That would be great.
And then we'll open it up to any questions or anything from the community that you guys would like to talk about, address, or show off. All right, we'll start with Jimothy.
Yep. My screen. Two doc updates from me. First one is a new topic that talks about client-side caching. It's under the overview section, under basic concepts, and it basically goes over different caching strategies, client-side caching strategies that we use, particularly specifically in Venia. Has links to more documentation that provides more details on each strategy. We also talk about caching an Apollo GraphQL client and how that's done in Venia. That summarizes that. The next one is an update. So Magento U has a page that lists some learning resources for PWA development in general, not specific to PWA Studio. This is where the videos for setting up the storefront and Docker deployment are posted. It has a lot of links to useful training sites for learning how to use the technologies that we use in PWA Studio. This basically supplements the documentation of the dev docs. And yeah, any questions?
Do we get to see Tommy's awesome acting in any of these videos?
No.
Almost.
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, what is the best way to share? Should I call into the meeting or just plug in?
I should just plug in there.
I'll post this link in Slack and in the chat.
That's right. Cool. Can everybody see that my screen? Authenticated users PR?
Yes.
Cool. So one thing I worked on that I thought would be cool to show off is the authenticated user checkout flow. So previously in the code base, there were lots of kind of early outs if a user was signed in. And there were a lot of bugs around that, like, hey, I'm attempting to add this item to my cart and I can't do it, or edit the item, or remove the item, whatever the case may be. So I went through and fixed a lot of that. These are using, if folks are familiar with the REST endpoints, these are just the carts/mine endpoints once you're already signed in. So here's the PR, updates the REST calls, removes a thing from the checkout receipt telling you to sign in. You don't need to do that if you're already signed in. And basically the big thing is to enable an authenticated user to completely check out. So here's Venia. So if I sign in here with my super real user, and I kind of have the console open over here to the right. You can see some of the actions and stuff that are being taken. But here's our trusty guy, Freddie, is signed in. And then if I just add things to the cart. Oh, don't worry about all these errors over here. That's a completely different thing.
Yeah, we're going to match on those more than heuristic fragments in an upcoming Apollo client epic.
But you can see it was added to the cart successfully. I can come in here and edit. Hey, I want two of these instead. Do-do-do. I'm like, oh, geez, I don't want any of these. Never mind. And I'll remove it from the cart. But to actually check out, I have to add it back. So do that real quick. Oh, nose.
Your son do it twice.
Oh, that's not good. Who wrote this? That's ridiculous. Did it actually sign me in? Let me double check. I thought it would have my shipping stuff in there already. All right, well, we'll put that in there. The billing information here, this is just the dummy credit card. Not taking my input. I had this problem this morning too. I don't know. It obviously knows that I'm blurring out of these fields, but it won't let me type in them. Oh, this is a terrible demo. I'm sorry, y'all.
I've done so much worse. This is a great demo as far as I'm concerned.
I don't know what this thing is doing. It's like now completely frozen on me. Oh, I see a cursor. Hold on. Okay, we're good. Showing off the keyboard navigation. That's what I was really trying to show off here.
Something you can do on your phone.
Yeah, it's a strong point. Anyway, all right, we'll sort some of this stuff out. We got this demo on tape, so we can get it back.
We go back and edit.
But yeah, there you go. But you can see a successful order was submitted. Thank you for your purchase, and then that one bullet point from the PR that it doesn't prompt you to go sign in right now because it knows you're already signed in. So that is the end of this demo. Authenticated users.
Any questions from anybody for Andy?
Very cool, and I should mention GraphQL is going to make this easier. There was we updated the REST endpoints if you're signed in to use the carts mine endpoints, but I didn't make any of that really super easy on purpose, knowing that the GraphQL changes soon. We'll just switch over to GraphQL and we can delete most of this stuff anyway. So, but for now, you can sign in and complete your checkout flows. So that was pretty cool.
All right. Well, if there are no questions for Andy, then James, I'll turn it over to you to cover kind of the updates from Peregrine Search component, as well as updates for any of the things that you've been working on for the last couple of weeks.
I would love to. I will certainly start by saying that the demo that Andy has done, everything that went weird with it was totally not part of the main purpose of the demo. Like, authenticated users is a tough thing to achieve because our GraphQL API and our REST APIs are not designed so far around interacting with a browser in this context. When you talk to a browser, you need to respect cookies, and the API endpoints kind of don't. Instead, the browser is required to like manually keep sending this authentication token. That's part of what makes it hard, but when we switched to GraphQL, the GraphQL teams assured me that they're going to start respecting cookies in the first place. So that's one reason, really separate from the GraphQL API, that this stuff is going to be easier. But that's why it's been challenging thus far, kind of, is authentication management is something the browser knows how to do, but the APIs are not expecting it. So that said, I also want to let everyone know that we have been working in tandem with, we've been working with the GraphQL team and having meetings with them to talk about upcoming additions to the schema. And the main big change that we should start to anticipate is that a lot of our GraphQL operations are going to move to an asynchronous model, and not just in the sense that the browser places like fetch requests that are asynchronous, but that as Magento becomes a more parallelized, a more distributed system that may have like multiple serverless instances that are serving the same PWA, it'll be necessary for us to place GraphQL calls that return a pending object, like with a job ID. And then we have to check up on the status of that job periodically with polling, or maybe in the future with subscriptions, so that we can find out whether one or more operations succeeded, like adding to cart or adding to wish list. So this is going to allow us to do some really efficient synchronization by placing a bunch of calls and then doing a background query to get updates from them. And that's going to reduce our request load. That's really good. But it's also going to require that we do some direct interaction with this asynchronous API concept. So what we want to do is make sure that people who implement new GraphQL stuff are aware of it, but that they may not have to deal with it if we can get a good abstraction going. Because in most cases, you don't want to do job control. You just want to add something to the cart, and when it's done, it's done. We would like people to be able to use this same simple GraphQL request and REST request patterns that they're familiar with that work for our purposes, but we want to allow, if you want to, for you to get kind of under the hood. So just let me take a few minutes, since we have some left in this, to show you the pull requests over in the Magento architecture repository that goes into this in some detail. I don't have demos for this yet because we just found about it this week, but it's pretty important to get the hang of. So, can you see my Chrome?
Yes.
No.
No.
Definitely.
Definitely not. Now let's give him a few seconds to rejoin. Let me ping him real fast and make sure
He's back.
it says it's Sage to rejoin.
Evidently, you could not see my Chrome.
You gotta use the share button, not the hang up button.
Hey, you know what? You know what? That was a crash. In its own time, OS 10 is going to give me that dialogue saying, would you like us to find out what happened? Okay. Can you see my Chrome?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is a proposal by Anton Capula, one of the senior architects. There are other architects who you can converse with on Twitter or through the community engineering chat or through any other channels you'd like to talk about this proposal. But we had a meeting with them. Oh, actually, this is the pull request. Let me view the actual file. Ding. Now you can view it with a little bit of formatting. So as he said, and as I said, Magento is going to have to support higher and higher concurrency of operations. And that's the best road to performance for our backend systems, especially with GraphQL. So right now, when you do create empty cart in the GraphQL Edge API that we're not using yet, you just get back the cart ID that you just created. So that, in the server's point of view, is a synchronous operation. Now, instead, what we want is to start returning these things called operation state interfaces. And this is a little bit strange, I think, if you're familiar with GraphQL APIs that other systems have and the existing GraphQL APIs we have today. But remember that this is mostly to do with the change in how mutations work. So actually, the rest of this is the query. So the mutations are the main change. And so if you, for instance, were to create an empty cart with the modern mutation, what you would want to do now is run this mutation and expect to receive back an identifier and a type name. The type name is going to indicate the status of the request, and the identifier will be an ID for you to hold on to, where you can query the status of that request later. So you receive something like this. And the type name says operation accepted. So we're going to use a built-in feature of GraphQL that lets you check on the type name with introspection, and the type name indicates a status. So that's a nice little usage of GraphQL's features. So once you have this operation, then you need to place a follow-up query to a root query type called Q. And then you send it an array of operation identifiers like this. And it returns an operation state interface collection so that you can query the status of a number of different operations simultaneously. So with this create empty cart identifier. This represents a job that's going on to create an empty cart. Who knows how long it'll take? Not long. You just want to be able to do job control. Then we can query for that and other operations at the same time and find out that the operation was accepted. And then once you've done that, then you can actually request more information based on a particular concrete type of that operation. So for the empty cart, for instance, you could ask for what entities changed, and you receive a cart entity because that's a specific request for a specific list of implemented operations. And then you get, for instance, if you say, give me the cart operation completed fragment on this completed operation, then it's going to actually give you the full cart. So effectively, when you run this queue operation, as you proceed through the PWA and navigate around, the client learns all of the concrete types of the different queuing operations that it does. And then your query gets more and more sophisticated. It asks, for a cart operation, give me that cart back and give me the change in items. So this does add an extra layer of indirection and abstraction to dealing with our GraphQL APIs. That's a cost that they essentially are passing from their server side to our client side. And you could think of that as bad news. But what we plan to do is implement a link in the Apollo client that can handle this type of operation silently, so that when you run create empty cart, it will conduct this pair of operations and then return the cart to you from the final concrete check on cart, as though you didn't have to deal with any of this stuff. You still should have the option of dealing with this stuff, and if you make direct calls to those APIs, Apollo should let them through. So, in summary, Magento GraphQL team is going to start giving us mutations so that we can get rid of REST API completely. But those mutations are going to have an asynchronous pattern that requires us to do some job control requests. Extra requests are bad, but we can group simultaneous operations together so that it ends up being a very efficient type of request. We can also implement a change in our own client so that if you're doing simple things and building UI and you don't want to think about it, then you can use synchronous feeling GraphQL API. Then the Apollo client and the service worker will do that hard work. This is a proposal, and it's in the proposal state currently. You can always look up proposals by going to the Magento architecture repository and checking out what is in process of being proposed and of being approved. And so what this means is you get a sneak peek, you get a preview of the way that in the future, certainly after Imagine, probably after another minor or major release of PWA Studio, your GraphQL interactions are going to have to work. So this is a big subject, and I don't expect that everybody is going to understand all of it immediately. I certainly didn't when I heard about it first, but because it's going to take some time to process and intake, I wanted to start talking about it in the PWA community early and take this opportunity during a call to bring it to everyone's attention. So does anyone have any immediate questions or concerns about this new API pattern that is going to show up in a couple releases time?
The glue piece of it, that the logic that we put in the Apollo client to kind of stitch these things together, we will open source that obviously so other people can use it, right?
That's going to be part of the PWA Studio suite of software tools. I think while Peregrine is in flight, which I'm about to show off, unless Jimmy has signed into the call, has he?
I do not see him on.
Okay, well then I'm going to show off a little bit of Jimmy's operation too. Whoa, somebody is trying to connect to my. Oh,
While you're getting set up, I'll also point that Mr. Kalkoban has posted the link for that pull request in the chat for this meeting. If you're looking for that.
Hey, that's great. Thank you. I was going to do that.
Hey, James, is this? I mean, your example is on a cart, which I think of as a fairly simple operation. Will it still be asynchronous for those simple
Me too.
operations, or is it only really targeted for what we think of as kind of long-running requests?
So, David, to be clear, this is not my example. I am showing
No, right? No fair.
the
No fair.
proposal.
That's a very fair statement. Good call out. Good call out.
Yeah. So their example is create empty cart, and I think that's on purpose because even though that should be an almost instantaneous operation, they want our APIs to be consistent so that even something small goes through the same pattern of workflow and the same interfaces.
Right.
And that's important for Andy's question, which is when we implement this glue code that kind of abstracts this away and hides it for people who don't want or need to deal with it, then that glue code should be pretty simple because every type of operation from create empty cart to change shipping address to change account information to place order should all have a really similar or the same set of operations to place the request and then manage the job. When we talked about this, I said, very few user interactions from a UX point of view really need to expose this asynchronous job control. When you click place order, you don't want to have like an order maybe running in the background and then you continue shopping, like not knowing whether your order is done. But there are some use cases where our UX people are exploring the possibility of some operations like that being queued. So there may be some cases where you use this API directly, but in a lot of cases too, you shouldn't have to worry about this. Like, David, create empty cart should not be an operation that the shopper sees as being queued. And we want to make sure that if you're implementing some cart functionality, that you can just write a simple GraphQL request and we will deal with it in the plumbing to do this asynchronous management.
And do you know if is there going to be some system sitting in front of the load balancer to manage these queues and, kind of hand a queued request to a specific node based on, availability of that node? Or is it always going to be once that queue starts on a node, it stays on a node?
That is a question that you would want to put to the GraphQL team. It's on purpose. That is totally opaque to the PWA client. The PWA doesn't have to manage any of that server instantiation.
Right. Just think of it in terms of, when you think of the cost points on the client side versus the cost points on the server side. So interesting. I'll take that up with them. Thanks, man. Thanks.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Anyone else have questions about this? Nah. Okay, let me switch to Jimmy mode. Just a moment here.
Engage Jimmy mode. Please
never win.
Please never win. Please.
By the way, James, I should close back up and say, very cool that we're talking about this because I think this looks like a very nice answer for some people who say our systems can get overloaded.
Yeah,
right?
They worked hard on it, and I'm very impressed by it. Thank you. Hi, I'm Jimmy. This is my cat. I'm here to talk to you about the beginnings of the new Peregrine experience. And this is, I try to use simple words lately. I help by hitting myself on the head before these calls. I'm going to say revolutionary API and tooling library for you to write PWA UIs and connect them really simply to data and state. If you're not familiar with React hooks already, then we can go over them briefly. But correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew and Andy. Did Jimmy go through React hooks? Didn't he go through the React hooks concept in an earlier PWA community sync or not?
I think so. Did he read his proposal one time?
I was out for 3
I was going to say, I was out for a while too.
I think he presented his blog post.
Yeah, so his blog post is out there, and for those of you who haven't read it, React hooks is a new feature in a new version of React that the React at Facebook team has been working on for months and months to try and create a new ultra simple API for code reuse inside functional components. One of the most important consequences of it is that you no longer have to write classes. And as a matter of fact, if you use hooks, you can't write classes for your React components. This is going to take some getting used to, but from a front-end development point of view, it means less boilerplate and less to worry about. If the hooks work correctly, they're just functions you call, and you don't have to think about the state management that can often be so hard. So hold on just a minute. Let me get my watch going, and I'm going to share my whole screen. Wait. Okay. It's building. It's serving. It's loading. And it works. Sort of important for me to get there. I'm not subtweeting no one. So, can y'all see the code?
Yes.
Okay. I try to make the code parts of these demos very brief, but the new search bar experience is in a component in Venia just like anything else, but it utilizes something called autocomplete, which is a separate individual component inside the search bar component system. This is part of, if you look at the PWA Studio, well, actually, James, Mr. Kalkman, are the code structure guidelines published? I forget.
Yes, they are.
They are, okay. So if you look at the code structure guidelines at the documentation website, the Venia storefront structure requires that in your components directory, you make sure that components, does this say what we want it to say? Sorry,
you might be
I'm
looking
totally out.
at the wiki in the repo.
Oh, we're thinking of the wiki in the repo?
Yeah, I think that's what you're referring to, the standards that we worked on.
Yeah, sorry. I wasn't expecting to be demoing this, so you'll have to forgive me. But it is fun to demo. And this is the code requirements. Is that what you're talking about? Oh, project standard coding.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So inside React components, they're contained in a single folder, and the index.js file exposes their API. So in the case of this search bar, it's the search bar component itself. But we've separated the actual autocomplete functionality, which handles the concept of checking the product search. I'm sorry, my cat fell off. Handles checking the product search. We've abstracted that into an individual component. So you can see that we use autocomplete in the search bar, but the search bar itself is just responsible for showing and hiding itself, which is nice. You might also notice that search bar itself is no longer a class. You don't see class search bar extends component, and you also don't see the component class even being called from React. This is a single function. And you might have heard of stateless functional components in React before. And it doesn't seem to me like a search bar, which has all of this state, and then it would actually have, it's taking a little while, yeah, that it would actually be a good fit for this stateless functional component, because those things are supposed to be a direct function of props that are handed to them. And the idea that something that all this state inside it would be a straight function seems like it's a serious performance problem. Here's the great thing. You might notice that this component, search bar, checks to see every time it runs whether there's been a change by running the use callback hook. Now this callback hook gets executed asynchronously, and React optimizes how fast and when it is run. So then this thing can run set expanded which is also something coming from a different hook, use dropdown, which abstracts all of the plumbing and handling of a dropdown. And when this set expanded function gets called, the use dropdown plumbing eventually runs this function again. So what you've done is, instead of thinking every time anything changes, this whole component, this whole function executes, you can start thinking that the calling of hooks delegates the program control back to React so that it can render the rest of this thing if and when it needs to. So now we have a hook that calls and finds out whether the handle has changed, whether you've changed focus, and whether you've clicked the submit button. Similarly, here in the autocomplete, we have a use effect hook that checks to see whether it's visible and valid, and those visible and valid attributes are passed into the second argument of the hook. So again, that React knows when it needs to call this callback again and how to check what has changed. So again, this is a set of data access and data manipulation functions that all get run at the very top of the component. And React handles returning those and executing these really, really fast. And then once it has assembled all of the state that it needs to render, a list of suggestions, then and only then it'll return DOM. And then when it returns out, then returns the autocomplete DOM into the search bar component, and the search bar component will then render its DOM, again, after collecting the state that it needs. So again, the result there is a pretty fast component, one that, if we do a quick performance analysis, doesn't seem to be, despite being all functional,
Try typing tank.
and now here we are on another page, and then tank is what that mystery voice just suggested that I try. So those delays, those are coming from the GraphQL API, like you might expect. But if you actually look at the graph of performance, there are a couple of spikes in there, but the actual rendering has almost no significant delays in it. So what's wonderful about that is that we were able to accomplish this degree of performance without writing class search bar extends and then maintaining our own state and running set state. We have delegated all of that work to React. And so this concludes the code looking at part of the demo. This is, I hope that a lot of you will agree, a little simpler, even if it takes some getting used to, than managing things with classes and then passing handles and references around in those classes. You can think of them as mix-ins. Use callback, use dropdown. Some of the custom Peregrine hooks that we've created, like use query. You can think of these as mix-ins in that if this was a class, you would just declare that this mix-in adds functionality to this component. The difference is that these mix-ins execute each time, and that's mysteriously fast. And you don't have to worry about the problems you get with mix-ins in other systems where they cause serious performance downgrades and they can end up colliding with each other. These mix-ins always return specific return values and objects, which you can then combine in the way that you need during every render cycle. It's a really robust and really scalable system. And so Peregrine is beginning again as a collection of hooks. Hooks can connect you to data. They can help you manage UI. And we have hooks for grabbing the Apollo client, for subscribing to an effect by listening to an event on the document or the window, like we showed you by managing the state of a dropdown for you so that you don't have to put this plumbing in every dropdown style component. For running a GraphQL query, which is pretty exciting, you don't use that query component anymore. And even for something as specific as using values from search parameters so that you can set a value in one component every time the text field in another component changes. Or getting search parameters from, in this case, getting search parameters from the URL so that a component can connect to the URL without having to know specifically about window location. So this kind of loose coupling and this kind of mix-in style functionality should help you to implement components that connect to Magento and connect to the GraphQL API without having to encode too much logic and too tight of functionality integration into your components themselves. This is going to enable you to import Venia components and use their style, or to import the underlying Peregrine hooks and write a very thin layer of UI on top of them. In addition, we may end up with some build time utilities which can modify or even replace the functionality of some of these hooks themselves. So this represents a lot of new extension points and represents the way that new components will be implemented, and that ultimately from community we're gonna hope that you start implementing new components that you contribute. So that is the code part of the demo, and this is the holy crap it works part of the demo. Pants. And I will now delegate further questions about this to the mystery voice who just appeared online, but for whom I can vouch a fair bit of knowledge about this pull request in particular. Jimmy, you want to take it away?
Hello, everyone. Sorry I'm late.
And before Jimmy goes, James, did the cat land on its feet? I want to know if that was a real cat. The only way to know is if it landed on its feet.
Jimmy, I had a cat, so people thought I was you. And David, I'm sorry to report that the cat did not land gracefully. Okay. All right.
That is
Stop showing my screen.
Wonderful.
So Jimmy, what I went over basically was the justification for bringing hooks in. I didn't introduce the entire concept of hooks, and our intention to make Peregrine the repository for the data connections and the library out of which you kind of pull the plumbing stuff that otherwise you'd have to replicate in a lot of UIs.
Right.
And then I showed off the fact that despite them being functional components that don't do between render state management at all, they are still super performant. I did that with a little flame chart in performance. And then I rambled a bit about how exciting this was. Now it's up to you if you want to provide any more detail.
Yeah, I think actually the demo that you had done, the parts of it I saw there covered it really well. And the flame graph is a helpful way of understanding one of the major benefits of switching over to hooks from classes is that hooks is React's solution to really fine tune render performance in a way that doesn't require us to manually optimize it all the time, right? That this really helps us interact with their scheduler, which is good. But the other thing that it does for us, I don't know if you covered this earlier, is that it allows us to accomplish the same thing that render props were accomplishing.
Yes.
That by putting all of this logic into hooks, we can write a component that is not only not opinionated about style, because it can not have CSS, it can not be opinionated about the exact DOM that's returned. And so if you wanted to do something that's a really common operation, such as render an input field, right? If the field component we provide does not include, let's say, for example, a label that depends on the value, you can actually change the rendered output of the input, of all inputs, by using an input specific hook that we have, and then rendering in addition to an actual input element. You can wrap it with a div, you can include a label, and then you can take the same prop that we were giving for the input and use it to adjust the label. That's the kind of thing that you can do if we make hooks out of our components. And so we're going to see more of that.
Yes, that's true. One of the things in common React idiomatic code that has always kind of seemed the weirdest and the most like a hack has always been the render prop, the function that you place inside a JSX node. It's the thing I think that people have a hard time getting used to when they're switching from a plain markup language to JSX, and it'll be nice to make that a more rare occasion.
Right. So I'll show real briefly here. I'm not going to go on too long about this.
Are you sharing your screen?
Yeah, I'm about to. Here we go.
We have about 2 minutes left in the meeting, so.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, this is 30 seconds. So we're gonna say that this is the way that a component normally looks, right? This is the way all of our components are in Peregrine or are in NVIDIA, right? We have a bunch of logic, and then ultimately we return some DOM. But what we will eventually end up with likely here is something more akin to this, where this is the same kind of component, but we've taken all that logic and put it into, as Zetlin described it, a mix-in, called use text field. We pull out basically props come from this function. And then you could either use text input, which gives you an element, or if you really wanted to customize it, you could just use the hook itself, take the same props, and return literally any DOM shape that you wanted. So it's just like a render prop. At any rate, Zetlin demoed the majority of that work, which did not include this particular breakdown of components into hooks everywhere. So we're starting slowly. We're soliciting feedback. We've got a couple more features lined up for hooks, but this isn't going to be a total refactor overnight. This is just, we're slowly integrating these things and we're looking for feedback. So if you're interested, take a look at the open PR about search, leave some comments, open an issue, and we'll move forward with it.
All right, thanks guys. So we are at time. I think we wanted to save time for questions, but I would say if you have any really burning questions around what we've demoed today, let's continue the conversation in the community Slack. Given that we are at time, we'll go ahead and wrap up. So thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks for Jimmy, James, Jimothy, Andy for their demos. And we will pick up again next week with the same great type of updates from the team. There we go. Boom. Ended. Call it. Thanks, everyone. See you guys.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.